Okay, so for today's cool down, we have an interesting topic and a special guest. So the topic is going to be about high altitude acclimatization, and the special guest is Connor. So Connor, why don't you give your brief intro and then we'll get started.
Hey, yeah, excited to be recording with y'all. I'm Connor. I live in the Boston area. I'm a distance runner, mostly marathons, but all kinds of stuff. I met Ty. Well, I first started working with Ty as a coach back in 2020, I think. And then we became really good friends, and we've gone on lots of adventures together, mostly to high altitude locations to do silly things high up in the mountains. So yeah, very
Yep.
appropriate.
So a good person to join us to talk about high altitude acclimatization. Thanks for joining.
Definitely. And
Um,
and I will just say for our listeners, if you've been listening week by week, Connor, we talked about Connor last week because he was actually here in Quito with me for about a week, and we climbed Cotopaxi together and stuff. And we Connor's also one of my best friends, so he skipped that part. So that's why he's here.
okay,
He's an incredible resource, and he's hilarious and my best friend, and we have a lot of awesome dumb adventures, and I can't wait to nerd out about altitude together.
Let's
great.
do it.
All right. So, Connor, you've been up in the mountains with Tyler. Can you share your perspective on how each of you approach altitude differently and how this might differ from the conventional wisdom about altitude and acclimatization?
Sure. So I can really only speak for myself. My experience with Tyler and altitude is he's pretty much always more or less acclimatized, and it has very little impact on what he does. Now, I haven't gone to the Himalaya with him. I haven't gone up to above 7,000 meters with him, so I'm sure it's a different story there. But for the stuff that we've done in South America and the Andes, I tend to meet up with him somewhere, and he's been there for a bit, so he's already good to go. My first trip to altitude was to Ecuador on a Chasqui trip with Ty, and my experience with that was that a lot of people on the trip, or some people on the trip, were had headaches and were feeling kind of crappy and were struggling with some activities, and I felt totally fine. And Ty would say, "Wow, I can't believe like how well you're doing on this," and I'd say, "I don't know, I'm just doing it. I don't have any waypoints or any points of reference for like should this be harder? Should I feel worse?" I'm familiar with all the risks of acute mountain sickness and HAPE and HACE, so I've always tried to be somewhat cautious. But as we continue to do more things, I think that the extreme example was in I think 20. When did we go to Tanzania? Was that
Early
2022?
2023, it would have been
Right.
about
So
2 years ago.
Ty sent me a message. Hey, do you want to go to Kilimanjaro next week? And I said, okay, sure, why not? And ended up going from sea level to the Barafu camp, which is about was it 4,700 meters, I
Yep.
think, or 4,300 meters. It's pretty
47.
high.
Yeah.
47 in under 48 hours, and then went to the summit of Kilimanjaro. I think about 36 hours after that. We took a rest day in between, but it was basically
Thank goodness.
2 days to Barafu, a rest day, summit, which is dramatically more aggressive than anybody would ever recommend doing. The sort of I talked to a friend of mine who's a doctor, and she gave me a sort of list of like risk factors for HAPE and HACE and AMS, and the the canonical example was ascending Kilimanjaro in less than 7 days puts you at significant risk for us. So,
Whoops.
we did that in less than half, and this is a theme with doing things with Tyler that goes beyond just altitude acclimatization, but we have a lot of fun, we mess around, but at the end of the day, he really knows what he's doing and is very experienced in those mountains, and I trust him completely. And when he says, "I've seen what you've done before, you'll be fine," I can, more or less rely on that. Now, I'm always, touching wood when I say this, it could all my luck could run out. But so my experience with going to altitude has been that, like, wow, I feel like I'm very lucky in that I really don't have to worry about this very much. Now yeah, sure, it feels harder, but I never feel sick. I've never had any health issues with doing that.
Okay, so as the jargon police, can you explain what, I think you use three terms, HAPE and HAFE and AM something or other?
Yeah, so AMS is acute mountain sickness. It's basically your sort of headache, malaise, not sleeping well.
Nausea.
It's
Yeah.
you're not gonna, yeah. It's not a life-threatening condition. It's just feeling crappy from going to altitude
Okay.
from sea level.
Uh-huh.
HAPE stands for high altitude pulmonary edema.
That sounds
This is
serious.
it is extremely serious. It's a life-threatening condition. It's a medical emergency. People die from HAPE. This is when your lungs fill with fluid and you need to descend as quickly as possible. And HACE stands for high altitude cerebral edema, and that is a fluid buildup
Yep,
in your
your brain.
brain. And that is also a medical emergency and life-threatening potentially if you cannot
Okay.
descend.
Yep. And
Okay.
HAFE, which you also mentioned, is high altitude flatulence excretion, which is a real thing. You can look
Yes.
that up. It's basically
That is,
the idea that you fart a lot more at altitude because there's all these
You
pressure
gotta-
changes
gotta equalize
inside
the
your body.
pressure,
It's
yeah.
true. You
Yeah.
got to equalize that pressure, man. You got to let
Yeah.
those farts out.
yeah. Yeah, no,
That's a real
the
thing.
HAFE is real.
The HAFE is very, we have
so
a
you
very
need
strong
to
supporting evidence
either
of
keep
that.
your distance or pack one of those air freshener things along in your
Yep.
backpack.
Something like that.
Okay.
And the other, I want to just jump in before we go to the next question, because I think Connor said a lot of important things. And the big caveat is that, when I am with anyone, whether it's a friend or a big group of people with Chosky, like a big part of my job is looking at how people are responding and looking for those AMS symptoms or those HAPE symptoms, or even just something as simple as how out of breath is this person walking up the stairs in the morning on the way to breakfast or something, And one of the things I saw with Connor, I remember that very first trip. That was literally the first time you and I ever hung out in person, I think. And it was like the second day or third day, and we went up Ruku together on the Telferico and like ran up in the rain. And like everybody else just kind of like walked around a little bit, and you and I like ran all the way to the bear cave or something, which is like 4,400 meters. And I was like, whoa, I guess this guy's like totally fine. And that's cool. So it's like the thing that I found is like usually past performance is a indicator of future performance. So if you've had experiences where you've gone to altitude before, and you felt fine, it's not a golden ticket, but it's usually, if you're going to have a lot of problems, you're going to have them immediately. So like I know people who have gotten HAPE and HACE at like 10,000 feet in Colorado, and that's super, super rare, but that happened like the first time they went up. So if you're going to have a problem like that, it often manifests really early. And if you are not going to have a problem like that and you feel fine, like that's generally more of a, yellow light, proceed with caution kind of thing. But, all of this stuff is with the caveat that like there's a lot of like do as I say, not as I do. And like you should really, if you're going to altitude and you're listening to this, like you should be with someone who knows what they're doing and who's been to altitude before and who can keep an eye on you for a safety side, because like HAPE and HAZE are super, super serious. People do die every year, whether it's in Colorado or it's in the Himalaya, super serious conditions. So, what Connor and I do, and like going to Kilimanjaro in 3 days is like totally outrageous, but like, it is a really serious thing, and like people do get killed up there from this. So we should like put that caveat at the very beginning here.
Okay.
Very good point.
And just to calibrate it for mere normal mortals, I think the first time that my wife and I visited you, Tyler, your mother and I visited you in Quito, maybe the second day you took us up the cable car, which is not even all the way up, right?
No, it's like 4,000 meters.
Yeah, and we got off of that cable car and literally had to sit down and get almost down on our knees. So we didn't have altitude sickness in that sense. We didn't. At least I didn't. I didn't have a headache or anything. I just couldn't breathe. Just literally couldn't breathe. And so for most people, the altitudes you guys are talking about are really, really difficult. They're not trivial at all. And so it's unusual. And yes, you do have to be cautious going up to any of these altitudes, even lower altitudes like where we were. you will feel it. You get used to it. You do get used to it. We get used to it, but it's not easy, especially when you first walk out for most normal people. And speaking of which, so do you think that you two are special?
Obviously.
And how do you adapt? Or do you, or I'm seriously though, do you think there's something about your physiologies or something, or do you think that the conventional wisdom is just wrong?
I think it's probably a little bit from column A, a little bit from column B.
Yeah. Porque no
I
los
mean,
dos.
with me and Tyler, I mean, we're talking about an experiment of two right here,
Yep.
and we know for a fact that Tyler is a world-class athlete. There are very few, if any, people who can perform better than him at very high altitude. And then there's me, and so we have pretty limited data. I think that, and this is where we can go into maybe a little bit more of a deep dive and a little bit of science here. I have a hypothesis that a high level of cardiovascular fitness can be protective against mountain sickness. Now, the literature and many articles which will cite the literature will say that fitness has no protective effect against AMS, HAPE, and HACE. And so I thought that was interesting. I said, well, I'd like to go and look at these studies. And so I found a few studies, and most of them seem to reference back to one study in particular. And so I found a PDF and I read the study. And what this study did was take a group of people, I think it was about 25 or 26 participants, and they measured their VO2 max at sea level. VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen that your muscles and your body can consume. It's a pretty kind of the gold standard for cardiovascular and aerobic fitness. They do this test on a treadmill. And then they brought them up to altitude, and I believe in Bolivia, and they observed them and they scored them. So sort of 4 categories, 0 to 3 score, basically to assess their degree of acute mountain sickness. And the study found that there was no correlation between VO2 max and AMS symptoms. But I looked at this study, and there was 2 people who had a VO2 max over 60. One person had a VO2 max of about 63. One person had a VO2 max of about 76. Everybody else is below there.
Those are
And
very high numbers for
Those are
context.
really,
Like,
those
numbers.
are like
Those you could be an elite marathoner with those numbers.
right. So there's very limited data in terms of, and so I just to say, those 2 people had pretty low scores for AMS, not 0, but you look at the criteria, there's things like insomnia, low appetite. If I were to score myself on one of these things, I wouldn't score a 0 because sometimes I don't sleep as well at altitude. I don't tend to have as much of an appetite at altitude. So they were sort of in line with what I would experience, I think. So it's hard for me to look at those data and say there is no effect, there's no protective effect of cardiovascular fitness on this, because you're only examining a small portion of people who are, extremely physically fit. I've never had VO2 max testing done, but, my race performances would probably put me somewhere in the mid 60s. So now, how well does this generalize to other people? If very, very few people have a VO2 max that high, well, what good is it to say, well, if you're really, really fit, you may not have as many of these symptoms? But I think I I would like to do more research. I'm not a scientist, but I think it'd be really interesting to repeat that study with very, very highly trained athletes, or even just people who, you know, do a lot of aerobic training. Sometimes these articles will talk about people who are, very physically fit because they're running 25 or 30 miles a week, which sure is a lot of miles compared to how much most people run. But you know, lots of people run 70, 80, 100 miles a week, even sort of amateur runners. So
Yeah.
I think it's
I
I
mean,
think more research is needed.
the thing that jumps out to me about that is that there's only 23 people in the study. That's such a small group. It's so like, you know, I've worked personally with well over 100 people. I mean,
Hmm.
I led high school trips and college trips. I probably had 20 or 30 people every single year, many of whom were coming to altitude for the first time and were runners of varying degrees from super beginner to, elite college runners. And so I saw this every single summer with 30 people for 10 years. I probably saw a couple hundred people worth of data. And I personally saw this correlation very strongly of, every summer at orientation, I would lie to everybody and say, there's no correlation. Don't worry. Cause you don't want people to feel bad and be like, oh, I'm less fit and therefore I'm going to suffer more. And then it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. But like 100%, like I think I saw a correlation between how well people adapted and how quickly they adapted, and their overall fitness. And I think you could see that, anywhere from, super beginner runner to very competitive runner. You could talk about VO2 max range of that's probably like 30 to 70 or something. It's a huge range. So I don't think you necessarily even need to look specifically at, just super elite runners. I think you could look at that whole spectrum, of weekend warrior to professional athlete. And I think you're going to see a pretty strong correlation there. Now, again, even a couple hundred people, I'm not doing actual science. Like this is all super anecdotal, but like my general experience is the fitter you are, the easier it is. And like, I do think that
Hmm.
bucks the conventional wisdom. And I think that to me, the biggest thing as someone who brings people to altitude and is in charge of their safety and their, overall experience, I think the biggest thing with the conventional wisdom that I disagree with and push a little bit is I think that, that idea, Connor, that you mentioned about risking HAPE is going up Kilimanjaro in less than a week. I think that almost all altitude protocols for going up high are based on the lowest common denominator. And so those things are usually really successful because they're catering to the person who is going to struggle. And so every single other person is going to be fine. And like, guess what? Like 90% of those people probably could be fine on a schedule that's 3 times more aggressive than that. But they're never going to do that because the guide is saying, okay, I have a big group and I'm going to cater to the lowest common denominator where I feel like, okay, I'm going to cater more to the median and say, I think that most people can do this. I don't think everybody's going to be Conor and they're going to go up Kilimanjaro in 2 days or something, but I think that most people can maybe do a little bit more than a conventional wisdom. So I think that's kind of where I would disagree and where I push back. And again, I still try to be more conservative than I would if it were like just you and me, Conor. Like when we do the Atacama trip, for example, like that's a way more gentle schedule than if it were just the two of us. And
Hmm.
that's even you coming from sea level, but it's still way more aggressive than like any other program out there. If you look at other trips to that area.
Yeah. I think the other thing that is related to athleticism and training at altitude, especially if you're going to go up high and do something difficult, do something athletic, is just having a training to say, I can feel really, really bad and it's gonna be fine. And because like this is
Yep.
something that I mean I experience. Like I'm not gonna sit here and say that like, oh, I can go up to like 4,000 meters and like, run 5K at the same speed that I'm going to. Like, no, of course it like affects my performance, and working really hard very high feels incredibly bad. But I have done a lot of training. I have felt incredibly bad in training, and I've done enough of it at altitude that I just sort of know that it's like you move the sort of bar of how bad you can feel for a certain amount of time. Like if I did a VK, vertical kilometer, with Tyler in Peru, and I think I did it for about an hour. I think that was around my time roughly, and the the sort of perceived effort level was something that I could sustain at sea level for, gosh, maybe 20 minutes, but I don't know. It like for a much shorter amount of time. And so you just have these, need to adjust your mindset about how something is going to feel. And I think that athletes are more flexible in doing that. You can just say like, oh, well, that's like, that feels really bad, but apparently I can do it for a really long time, and as soon as I stop, it feels okay. So I think in that sense, also there's a mental component just to being okay with things feeling pretty uncomfortable.
Yep, sounds right. And I think the other problem and the reason people are probably generally conservative, especially with the normal population, is there's a lot of confounding factors. It's probably hard to design a study that can really tease out what's the effect of cardiovascular fitness versus, well, some people just don't sleep well in general from time to
Sure.
time, or some people's appetites just aren't as regular as others. There's just a lot of factors involved in something, and it's also pretty subjective. Like, how do you feel today?
Right.
Some symptoms, I guess, you have a headache. Even headaches, right, have varying levels. Um, but so I think these studies are always hard to design because once you start talking about metabolism, the complexity goes off the charts. And that's fundamentally what you're talking about here. So you're trying to isolate one variable, your cardiovascular fitness, and saying, how does that affect your metabolism at altitude? It's a hard question, I think.
Yeah.
And yes, 23 people doesn't sound like nearly enough to make any significant conclusions. Okay.
I can't believe that all that conventional wisdom is based on one study of 23 people.
So
That's
I
outrageous.
I only spent about 20 minutes doing a literature review there,
Okay.
and I'm relying on articles that I can get access to without having any institutional journal
Yeah.
access. So there may be others, but this was the one that, like, what I saw most pointed to.
Yeah.
I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah. It's, for a brief, really dweeby diversion, if you want to read about this, read Brian Arthur's work from the 1980s and 1990s. He's the economist and super smart guy who actually developed the idea of the tipping points in a formal way, positive reinforcement. And when you get the internet and you get ideas, there's a lot of positive reinforcement once an idea gets out there. Everybody just says, oh, look at that. And we can joke and say, well, it's on the internet. It's got to be true. But that's what people do. And so one person cites it, then another person cites it, then another person cites it. The ranking algorithms, because most people are starting to link to it and use it, start to give it more credibility, or at least rank it higher up in the search results. And before you know it, you've got what we call an echo chamber. You have a very narrow selection that's getting positively reinforced, and nobody takes the time to actually go back and check. It's like the 10,000 steps on the pedometer, right? Which was just an arbitrary thing that somebody came up with 50 years ago. And now everybody thinks that's the gold standard. It's actually not. In fact, now there are studies that have looked at the number of steps, and most of them come far away from 10,000 steps.
Wait, is it higher or lower? We're way off topic.
Most studies, and again, the studies are weak because this once again interacts with a lot of things, say between 7,000 and 8,000 steps. Beyond that, the average person doesn't get much benefit.
Oh, sick. I can cut my training load way down.
Great.
We're pretty sure you're not an average person at this point.
And the other thing is all these articles are citing, Outside Magazine is citing this article and saying, fitness does not protect against this. And I'm sure that these studies authors wouldn't say,
right,
physical fitness has no protective effect against these things. What they would say is, well, from our data, from these 26 people,
link.
We didn't find any correlation between these things. That's all you can conclude from that. But people who are not as scientifically literate will see that and just take it as, oh, yeah, there's no protective effect.
Right. Yet another problem, the clickbait problem, but we won't go there now. Looking at your recent Cotopaxi success, what aspects of your approach do you think others could safely adopt? So part of our public service to the community, and which ones require the experience that the two of you have had over the years?
So I think there's two really big things that we can, hopefully safely help people do. And again, the last thing we'll talk about here, we talked about at the beginning, but again, we'll kind of reiterate the actual serious safety concerns. One of those is about sleeping. And the other is about basically, how you progress upwards and how you exercise and stuff like that. So sleeping, I think, is a really interesting one because the conventional wisdom, again, we've said that a lot this episode, the conventional wisdom is that, if you're climbing a really big mountain or you're moving up in altitude, that you kind of want to gently move up and up and up and up until, you're pretty close to the top of the mountain. So like if you're climbing Aconcagua or you're climbing Mount Everest, you're sleeping at 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, even 8,000 meters. I know it's brutal before you actually make a summit bid. And to me, I almost never do that. And this is one of these things where, like, we talk about I say do as I say, not as I do, where I actually apply this to my athletes and the groups that I lead and stuff like that. So for example, on the trip that we lead in the Atacama Desert in Chile, we go from sea level to 3,800 meters in one night. That's the beginning of the trip. First night we're at 3,800 meters. And then we actually try to never sleep higher than that for the entire trip. What we do is we go up high every day. So we climb high and sleep low. And that's kind of, I think, becoming a new accepted thing. But for a long time, especially on big mountains, that was not the thing. It was, you get this huge acclimatization benefit from going and sleeping up at 5,000 or 6,000 meters, and then you come down and recover. What I've found for myself, and I think Conor can speak to this too, is sleeping really high up is tremendously uncomfortable. And to me, it's a net negative on the body when you have such a bad night's sleep and such a miserable experience that even if you gain some small amount of acclimatization on a physiological sense, the overall detriment to your body from basically just having no rest that night and then having to go down and take a few days to recover, it's a net negative. It's not a good thing. And so I've had a lot of success with this, both with myself and with, again, lots and lots of people who I've brought to the mountains over many years at this point, where we almost never sleep higher than, base camp, whether that's in the Atacama or in Peru or in the Himalaya. Even Chris Fisher and I, when we were on Lhotse last year, we never slept higher than base camp. When I was on Manasa, we never slept higher than base camp. These are 8,000 meter mountains. These are really, really big mountains. And both of us summited without oxygen. So it's possible to do it. I think that one of the big things is, like, you have to be fit enough to cover more distance. So that is the caveat. And this is where I was talking about the fitness side. So I think this is another thing where if you can be fitter going up before altitude, it's going to have all these benefits. Not only are you going to acclimatize faster, maybe, but you're also just going to be able to cover more ground more quickly. And so it's going to reduce the need for those intermediary camps, especially in mountaineering. So you're able to do everything from base camp instead of having to go up to 6,000, come back down after, basically pulling an all-nighter, staring at the top of your tent, which is no fun. So yeah, that's my kind of thing that I would share with people is try and get super fit before you go up, and then think about, how can I do this mountain without ever sleeping higher than, the absolute minimum? What's the lowest I can possibly sleep while still being able to make trips up and down the mountain?
That's really interesting. It's almost like thinking of your fitness going into that as a sort of currency, and figuring out how you can then spend that currency, because it does seem like it can have kind of compounding effects where you now have this capability of covering more distance, which means that you can start lower, which means that you don't need to sleep higher, which means that you don't need to spend that time up there, which means that you can spend more time actually climbing and going high and doing more specific training, which makes you fit. It just kind of builds upon itself.
And there's a whole other piece, which is, guess what? If you have to sleep at 6,000 meters, you have to get all your stuff up to 6,000 meters. You got to bring a sleeping bag. You got to bring a stove. You got to bring food. You got to bring water sometimes. So not only is it, you actually have to go up there and sleep, but a lot of the time you're carrying 40, 50, 60 pounds on your back because you have to go carry all the stuff that you're going to bring up there, which versus if you're just going up there and then you're going to sit there and take some pictures and maybe sit for an hour or two and come down, all you need is a day pack, So it's a totally different experience.
Yeah, when we were at Cotopaxi, what we did, we slept at the lower lodge, which is about what is Tamapaxi at?
38, maybe 38.
Yeah. And then got up early, drove up to the parking lot, which is, maybe a half-hour hike from like the high Refugio. And I guess what most people do is they sleep up there,
Yep.
which is much higher. It probably is really uncomfortable to sleep there. I went in there. There are no rooms. It's just like open stuff, and you can put down a sleeping bag somewhere. I don't recall the exact logistics of how most people do this, but when Tyler explained it to me, I was like, oh, that sounds terrible. Like, what?
Yeah.
Why would you're basically you're getting a much worse night of sleep really high up to avoid like an extra, like, I mean, let's say people are going significantly slower, like an extra
Maybe an hour.
hour hike
Yeah. Maybe.
from the parking lot.
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem worth it. It seems
Yep.
like some aspects of the sort of conventional wisdom that
Yeah.
don't really stand up to scrutiny.
Yep. So,
Yeah,
anyways, long story short, my advice to our listeners as our public service announcement would be talk to your guides, talk to whoever is organizing your expedition, and ask, like, okay, if you're sleeping high in the mountain, why are we sleeping up there? Is it possible to skip that camp and go from base camp to Camp 3 or base camp to the summit? Think about those things, figure out what's required, what kind of fitness that would entail. Just don't just accept a schedule that's given to you, but actually, have a conversation with whoever is organizing it about what's possible.
So for our listeners who might be planning their own high altitude adventures, what warning signs should they absolutely not ignore, even when pushing boundaries?
Yeah, so I go over this with all of my groups, whether we're coming to Quito or the Himalaya. The number one thing is HAPE and HASTE. That's what Conor talked about at the beginning, cerebral edema, pulmonary edema. And those are super serious, life-threatening conditions. So we laugh a lot about altitude and how, like, the crazy things we've done. But again, this is super serious. So, if you are seeing someone who is having trouble speaking, acting like they're drunk, wobbling around, or if you are seeing someone or have a serious cough that has like bloody phlegm in it, super gross, but that's what you're looking for. Or like if you put your ear on their back and you hear like a really deep wheezing sound, those are your really serious symptoms of HAPE and HASTE. And those are going to be different than your normal acute mountain sickness, which again is like headache, nausea, loss of appetite, poor sleeping. Those things are normal. If it gets to the point where it's impacting your ability to speak, almost like you're having a stroke or something, or yeah, if you're having those pulmonary symptoms, that's when you really want to seek help immediately and get down. And I'll just throw the legal caveat, we're not doctors, we're not medical professionals. Like, please seek out your own advice, talk to doctors, all that stuff. So yeah, that's your HAPE and HASTE warning. Those are the really big things to look out for. And again, we're not medical professionals. We can't give legal advice. We obviously can't give legal advice. We also can't give medical advice. But yeah, talk to your doctors before you go up high. Listen to whoever's around you who knows what they're talking about, and have fun, enjoy it, and be safe in the mountains. That's the number one thing. So that's all I've got. Conor, thank you so much for being here, man. It's great to have you be a part of this. It was great to have you here. Climb Cotopaxi together last week, and I'll see you in a few weeks on my way to Nepal.
Oh, thank goodness. Can't come soon
Blessings.
enough.
I know.
Blessings.
Extremely blessed. All right.
All right,
guys. So guys, please send any feedback, questions, comments, concerns, hopes, dreams. You can send those to my email, ty@chosky.run, or DM me, Tyler Sanders, on Instagram. And remember, this is all multimedia. You can read my raw training logs on my blog at tylersanders.com, or get that delivered to your inbox via Substack at tylersanders.substack.com. Ty's Training is a Chosky Media production brought to you by Chosky Endurance Collective, the world's leader in online coaching, travel, and community for endurance athletes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys next week. Ciao.